In the autumn of 1882, while the settlers of Pine Creek stacked firewood and braced for the killing cold, blind Gregory was tying ropes, from cabin to well to barn to the village road, knot by knot, memory his only map. The townsfolk called it a spider web, mocking the veteran who thought he could tame what he couldn't see. But when a three-day whiteout erased every landmark, leaving the entire valley blind, only one man knew the way through. Gregory Hatch had been sightless for nearly a decade, a casualty of the war that had taken his eyes but not his determination. In the settlement of Pine Creek, he was a familiar figure, tapping his way along guide ropes he had painstakingly strung between the places that mattered most. While his neighbors dismissed him as a sorry old soldier, he was building a secret network of knots, each one a map, a direction, a lifeline. What no one realized was that the coming winter would prove that sometimes the only person who could truly see was the one walking in complete darkness. The war had stolen his sight at Cold Harbor, a shrapnel burst that left him forever in darkness. But Gregory Hatch refused to become a ghost sitting by a stove. When he first arrived in Pine Creek, he was already learning to see with his hands and his ears, tapping a hickory cane across unfamiliar ground, memorizing the feel of packed earth versus loose gravel. The frontier didn't reward patience for the blind. A man who couldn't spot a wolf on the ridge or read storm clouds gathering over the valley was a liability, and the settlement let him know it. His claim sat at the very edge of the village, a small cabin with a sagging roof, as if the community had pushed him as far out of sight as their charity would allow. But Gregory wasn't looking for charity. He was looking for a way to move. The first rope went up 3 weeks after he arrived. A thick, tarred line of hemp, anchored from the iron hook beside his door to the lip of his stone well, 47 yards due south. He had counted every step, felt the slight downward slope, the patch of loose stones at 22 paces, and tied a single knot at the halfway point. That knot meant turn left for the barn. A double knot meant straight on to the woodpile. Over the following months, a whole network branched outward, pulsing from his cabin like veins through the land. There was a rope to the village road, knotted at precise intervals, each knot a map of distance and direction that he could read with his fingers. A rope to the creek for water when the well froze, a rope to the outhouse. Every endpoint mattered, every knot was a sentence in a language only he could speak. He called it his web. The people of Pine Creek called it something else. Hatch's spider web, the storekeeper Harlan Jessup would chuckle, loud enough for the whole mercantile to hear. Blind man thinks he's a spider stringing lines across the valley like he's going to catch winter in a net. Men laughed. Women shook their heads. A few, with more pity than sense, offered to take his chores off his hands entirely, as though his blindness had left him incapable of living. Gregory ignored them. He kept nodding. He'd spent years in the army, trained to read terrain, to plan for ambush, to know that survival depended on having lines of retreat. He could feel the landscape through the soles of his boots, the way the ground tilted north toward the deep ravine, the way the wind funneled through the gap between two hills. He tied those sensations into his ropes. Each knot was a marker only he could interpret, a code no storm could erase. But the mockery didn't stay idle. One Sunday afternoon, a group of young men from the lumber camp, drunk and bored, cut a section of the well rope just to watch him stumble. Gregory found the severed end dangling in the cold, and for a moment he stood perfectly still, white knuckles around the wet fibers. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just retraced his steps by memory, retrieved a fresh coil, and spliced the line back together before sunset. The boys stood watching from a distance, their laughter fading. There was something unsettling about a man who couldn't be thrown off course. Meanwhile, the winter of 1882 was shaping into a monster. Old trappers like Elias Crow, who read the signs better than any almanac, noted the thick fur on the beavers, the early migration of geese, the peculiar stillness that settled over the valley in mid-November. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the mountains like the lid of a coffin. Snow fences went up, firewood piles grew, and the villagers braced for the worst. But every preparation relied on one fragile assumption, that you could see where you were going. And that's when Gregory began to notice something no one else did. The wind had changed its voice. He could feel it through the ropes, the tension shifting, the fibers humming with different notes. He'd stand at his door, one hand resting on the main guide line, and read the coming storm like a blind telegraph operator reading distant messages in wire. The knots were not just markers, they were sensors. Each vibration told him about wind speed, about drifting snow, about the angle of the approaching front. He started adding extra knots, smaller ones, designed not for navigation but for listening. The villagers thought he was just tying more useless loops. Harlan Jessup laughed that Gregory was knitting himself a sweater for the winter. But Gregory was building an early warning system that no one else possessed, a web that could feel the storm before it struck. The first flakes fell on a Thursday afternoon, tiny and dry, swirling sideways almost immediately. Within an hour, the wind rose to a shriek. By dusk, the entire valley was swallowed by a white so absolute that the boundary between ground and sky ceased to exist. A whiteout, the kind of blizzard that erases the world. Men who'd lived in the mountains for a decade knew what it meant. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. You couldn't tell the road from the ravine. The village shuttered itself indoors, and for 3 days no one moved. But that first night, a frantic pounding came at Gregory's door. It was Josiah Crane, the young farmer whose cabin lay a mile down the road, his voice shredded with panic. His wife, Sarah, was in labor and something was wrong. The baby was coming early and the doctor, Albert Cross, was 2 miles away in the pitch-black void of the storm. Without a guide, no one could reach him. No one could even find the road. Gregory opened the door, already reaching for his heaviest coat. The young man's words collapsed into desperate pleading. And Gregory knew in that frozen instant that the entire village, the same village that had called him a spider, a fool, a broken soldier, was now blind. And they would have to trust the very man they'd mocked to lead them through the darkness. He pulled on his gloves, felt for the main line, and stepped out into the howling white, the first knots already sliding through his fingers. The web had been built for exactly this moment. The only question was whether the storm would let him through. Gregory's left hand never left the main guide rope. The moment the door closed behind him, the world vanished. No sky, no ground, only a smothering white pressure that turned the air solid with ice needles. Josiah Crane stumbled behind him, clutching the hem of Gregory's coat, already shouting over the wind. But Gregory didn't answer with words. He was counting knots. The hemp burned beneath his wool gloves, every fiber vibrating with the storm's full rage. At the first single knot, he turned slightly right, pulling Josiah with him toward the branch line that led to the road. His boots found the packed track, and he could feel the snow drifting sideways against his ankles, but the line told him exactly how far they had gone. 22 paces to the next knot, 31 after that. He'd memorized every interval, every change in texture underfoot, and even in the whiteout the rope was his eyes. Then the rope went slack. Gregory stopped so suddenly that Josiah collided with him. The younger man screamed something, but Gregory barely heard him. He knelt, ran his fingers forward along the frozen line, and found the break. A severed end, clean, not frayed by ice. Someone had cut this line, not the prank from earlier, but the storm itself. No, he could feel the coarse knife marks. A fresh sabotage, maybe from that afternoon before the blizzard hit. Whoever did it had likely watched him splice the last cut and decided to make it permanent. But Gregory had prepared for exactly this. He pulled a spare coil from his shoulder, a thin but strong rope he always carried, and tied a bowline around the nearest solid post he could feel, the remnant of an old fence rail buried in the drift. He spliced the new line to the severed end, his fingers working by muscle memory alone, no need for sight. It took 3 minutes. The whole time, Josiah's breathing grew ragged with panic. Gregory stood, tested the tension, and once more began to move, recounting from the break point. They pushed forward into the mouth of the storm. The wind struck from the nor-northwest, exactly as Gregory had felt it doing through his web for days. He knew this angle. It meant the deep ravine would be to their left, hidden under a smooth blanket that could collapse without warning. He tugged Josiah closer and steered them onto the higher ground. His knots weren't just directions, they were warnings. A triple knot meant danger close. A small loop tied around the main line meant stop and listen. Those subtle codes, laughed at as senile fidgeting, now kept his boots from stepping into nothing. They reached the first checkpoint, the iron ring set into the old oak near the crossroads. Gregory slapped the frozen bark, confirming the route. Josiah pressed against the trunk, gasping, but they couldn't rest. The doctor's cabin lay another half-mile, and Sarah Crane's contractions were coming fast and hard. The baby was not turning. That was what Josiah had tried to explain before the storm. Dr. Cross had warned them weeks ago that a breech birth might require a difficult manual rotation. Without him, Sarah could bleed out in hours. Gregory tightened his grip on the rope and started again, pulling Josiah back into the white void. The second leg of the journey was worse. The snow had piled in invisible cornices along the main road, some of them waist-deep, and the wind had shifted, driving ice horizontally like a horizontal frost. Josiah's strength was fatting, his hands numbing even inside thick mittens. Gregory felt the rope tighten as the younger man fell to his knees. "Get up," Gregory said, the first full sentence he'd spoken since leaving the cabin. "I can't drag you. I can't see, I can't. Neither can I, but you're not the one leading. You don't need to see. You need to move." Josiah rose, half pulled by the rope, and stumbled onward. That was when Gregory felt a new vibration through the line, something heavy and rhythmic like footsteps coming toward them. No villager would be out. Then a dark shape materialized from the white curtain, a horse, its eyes wild with pain, dragging a broken shaft from its harness. The animal had escaped from someone's barn, disoriented and freezing. It nearly trampled them before swerving into the ravine. They heard it scream once, then silence. That horse was a reminder. The Whiteout didn't care who it took. The line to Dr. Cross's cabin was a secondary rope Gregory had tied only weeks before, after the doctor had treated him for frostbite on his fingers. The route passed through a narrow gap between two close-set cabins, then angled around a woodshed. Gregory felt for the junction knot, a thick cluster of hemp wrapped tight, and made the turn. A fresh wave of snow hit them, but now he could sense the rope growing steadier, the wind blocked slightly by the cluster of buildings. He counted 5, 6, 7 knots, and then his knuckles struck wood. The doctor's front door. He pounded with the side of his fist until the door cracked open, revealing a sliver of yellow lantern light and the terrified face of Dr. Albert Cross. The doctor was a precise man, meticulous, a man of instruments and textbooks, not superstition. He had once called Gregory's ropes an interesting but inefficient adaptation. Now he stood staring at the blind man and the half-frozen farmer on his doorstep, as if the blizzard had somehow delivered them from another world. "Sarah Crane is in labor," Josiah gasped. "The baby's wrong. She needs you." Cross's face went pale. "In this storm, it's suicide. I'll not walk into a whiteout at midnight to deliver a stillborn." Josiah lunged forward, but Gregory blocked him with an arm. He knew the doctor's fear wasn't cruelty, it was honest terror of dying blind in the snow. So he spoke quietly, the wind snatching his words almost before they formed. "You're a man of science, doctor. You believe in evidence. I just walked nearly a mile through this storm in complete darkness, and I'm standing at your door. I can get you there. The ropes will hold." Cross hesitated. Gregory heard the tiny click of a hand gripping the door frame tighter. "You'll tie a line from this door to my belt, and you'll keep one hand on my shoulder. You won't need to see. You only need to trust someone who can." For a long moment, the only sound was the screaming wind. Then the doctor turned, grabbed his bag, and tied on a thick leather belt. Gregory secured the rope himself, knotting it with an extra loop so there would be no chance of slipping. And then they set out into the howling dark, 3 men lashed together, led by a blind veteran feeling his way along a spiderweb of hemp. The return journey took longer. The snow had buried some of the guide ropes under fresh drifts, and Gregory had to dig for them with his bare hands, reading the landscape by the memory of its shape. At one point, he sensed the rope vibrating harder than before, a telltale sign that the wind was tunneling through the gap near the ravine. He halted them just as a massive cornice collapsed 15 feet ahead, swallowing the road in a sudden avalanche of heavy snow. Josiah cried out. Cross whispered a prayer. Gregory simply retraced a few steps and found the alternate line he'd strung parallel to the main one, a redundancy no one had understood. They reached the Crane cabin near dawn, though in the whiteout the light barely changed. Sarah was barely conscious, pale and slick with sweat, her breathing shallow. Cross pushed inside and Gregory stood in the doorway, holding the rope that had saved them all. Behind him, the blizzard screamed. What happened in the next hour pushed Dr. Albert Cross to the limits of his skill. The baby was indeed breech, and the umbilical cord had wrapped dangerously around the tiny chest. Cross worked by lantern light, his hands inside the warmth of Sarah's failing body, while Josiah held his wife's head and wept. And through it all, the storm outside battered the cabin as if demanding entry. But inside, the air was still, the fire hot, and Gregory stood ready. When the baby finally came, a small, blue, silent boy, Cross cut the cord and frantically rubbed the infant's chest, breathing air into his lungs until a thin, reedy cry broke through the cabin. Sarah opened her eyes. She lived. The child lived. And then Cross looked at Gregory, still standing by the door with ice frozen in his beard and the rope coiled around his fist, and said something that would echo through Pine Creek from that day forward. "You weren't walking blind. You were walking some kind of map none of us could see." Josiah was already kneeling beside his wife, but he lifted his head long enough to add, "If you hadn't come, we'd have died." But the storm hadn't finished with them. Not nearly. That afternoon, the blizzard intensified again, and word began to trickle, by shouts and improvised ties between houses, that other families were now trapped without firewood, without food, and in one case, with a locked barn door that was slowly burying its animals alive. The entire village was going dark, cut off from well and woodpile and root cellar, and the only man who could navigate the shapeless white was the one they'd laughed at. Gregory heard that knock on the door again. Not Josiah this time, but Harlan Jessup, the storekeeper who had first coined the name Hatch's Spiderweb. His voice was cracked with shame and fear. His grandmother was stranded alone in the family's far cabin, her fire gone out. The main road was indistinguishable from the ravine. Only Gregory's ropes, the very ropes he'd mocked, could lead a rescue party to her. The blind veteran listened without expression. Then he thrust a coil of fresh rope into Harlan's chest. "Tie this to your belt," he said. "You'll be my hands." It's time the web grew larger. Harlan Jessup's hands trembled so badly he could barely tie the knot around his belt. The storekeeper, who had once stood behind his counter, holding court over a laughing crowd while he mocked Gregory's ropes, was now lashed to the very thing he'd ridiculed. Gregory felt the tension through the line, the way a shaky grip translates into a thrumming insecurity. He didn't have time to soothe a pride already cracking. "Hold the line firm but not tight," Gregory instructed. "I'll feel every stumble you make. Don't fall. If you go down, you'll pull me off the path." Harlan swallowed hard. "How do you know where we're going? It's all white. I can't see anything." "I hear the wind bouncing off the old church tower. That's 30 yards east. Your grandmother's cabin is past the sawmill. The rope to the mill is still intact. I tested it this morning." Harlan had no reply. They set out, one blind man leading a sighted one who might as well have been blind. The storekeeper stumbled over every uneven patch, his panic rising each time the wind shrieked with renewed fury, but Gregory's pace never faltered. He felt the junction knot at the mill, turned sharply, and counted down to the smaller rope he'd strung out to the old widow's cottage 2 months ago, after she'd offered him hot bread and never laughed at him once. The door was frozen shut. Harlan pried it open with a shovel blade and found his grandmother huddled beneath a mountain of quilts, shivering, her candle long extinguished. She was alive but fatting. They wrapped her in blankets, tied her to a sled, and Gregory led them back, the rope humming with the wind's anger but holding solid. By the time they returned to the village center, a crowd had gathered inside the church, the only building big enough and warm enough to serve as a refuge. Word spread quickly. The blind man had saved Sarah Crane's baby. He'd fetched the doctor through the whiteout. Now he'd pulled old Mrs. Jessup from her frozen cabin. The whole settlement, trapped inside their lantern-lit sanctuary, began to murmur with something that felt dangerously like hope. But hope on the frontier was a fragile commodity, and the storm was not finished. Late that second night, the temperature plunged further. Ice began forming on the inside of windows, and the wind found every gap in every chinking. The firewood situation became desperate. The church's supply was meant for weekly services, not a siege. Families with small children began to shiver despite the roaring stove. Two men tried to reach the central woodpile by memory and nearly walked straight into the ravine, saved only by tripping over Gregory's warning rope at the very edge, a thin line he'd strung across the danger point with a clanging bell attached. They crawled back, terrified, and finally admitted the truth. They couldn't see the world they'd lived in their whole lives. It was then that Gregory rose from his seat by the stove and spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet authority that cuts through panic. He asked for 4 volunteers. He needed men who could follow orders without hesitation. He would lash them together in a chain, each one tied to his main line, and he would lead them to the woodpile and the well. They would haul back enough fuel to keep the church warm for 2 more days, but each man had to do exactly as he said. No heroics, no guessing. 4 men stepped forward, the blacksmith, the young minister, Josiah Crane, and Harlan Jessup. The chain was formed. Gregory led them out into the screaming dark, a single file of humanity clinging to a rope, all of them blind but moving forward. He found the woodpile by counting the knots, his hand never leaving the line even as the wind tried to shred his coat. The men loaded sleds until their arms burned, and then he guided them back, step by step, through the invisible world. That night, as the church stove roared with fresh fuel and the children finally stopped crying from cold, a strange thing happened. The minister, a young man named Elijah Ward, stood up beside Gregory and addressed the room. "We called this man's ropes a spider web," Elijah said. "We cut them. We laughed at them. But tonight that same web just saved every soul in this building from freezing. I think God gave Gregory eyes we don't possess." Gregory said nothing. He simply coiled a fresh length of rope in his lap and began tying a new knot, a complex one with multiple loops and a small wooden bead he'd carved in his spare time. Dr. Cross, watching from the corner, finally asked the question that had been burning in him since the rescue of Sarah Crane. "Gregory, how did you design this? How does a blind man survey a valley?" Gregory paused, his fingers still working the hemp. "When you lose your sight, doctor, the world doesn't disappear. It just changes language. The wind has a grammar. Snow drifts tell you where the ground rises. Sounds echo and they bounce back different depending on what they hit. I spent a year just standing outside my cabin, feeling the air move. The ropes are just notes. I write down what the wind already told me." The room went silent. This was not the rambling of a madman. It was the revelation of a method, a science of sensory substitution that no one had ever attempted on the frontier. Gregory wasn't just stubborn. He had taught himself to read a dimension of the landscape that sighted people ignored because they'd never had to listen. But even as this understanding settled over the villagers, the blizzard was preparing its worst. On the 3rd morning, just before dawn, a sound like a cannon shot ripped through the valley. Every head in the church turned. The blacksmith knew it immediately. That's the old sentinel pine at the head of the ravine. If it's gone, the whole snow shelf above the creek could go next. The sentinel pine was a landmark, an ancient tree that had held the slope above Pine Creek for centuries. Without its roots, the massive drift formation could become a moving wave of snow, a deadly avalanche that would sweep everything in its path. And the path led straight through the village. Panic erupted. Some shouted to abandon the church and run for higher ground. Others argued that moving in the whiteout was suicide. Gregory stood, and the rope in his hand suddenly felt heavier. He knew that slope. He walked it, felt the ground shape, tied a line near the base of that very tree. If the avalanche came, his web would be severed in an instant, and everyone who depended on it would be trapped. "We can't outrun an avalanche in this storm," Gregory said, "but we might redirect it." He called for the blacksmith and the strongest men. They would need to dig a diversion channel, a long trench that could steer the slide away from the church. And they would need to do it blind. For the next hour, the men worked at the edge of exhaustion. Gregory stood at the center, directing, calling out distances, feeling the vibrations through the ground as each shovelful of snow was moved. He'd studied the terrain for 3 seasons. He knew where the natural depression sat, a shallow gully that would carry the snow harmlessly toward the creek. He guided the diggers by sound and rope, his voice growing hoarser but never wavering. The minister held a lantern high, its light completely swallowed by the white, but the bell-like quality of Gregory's commands kept them oriented. Then the rumble began, a low, guttural growl that grew into a roar. "Get back!" Gregory shouted, yanking the rope that connected them all to the church door. The men scrambled, the line snapping tight as they pulled themselves hand over hand. Gregory stood his ground until the last man passed him, then turned and ran, his boots slipping on ice. The avalanche hit the diversion trench and poured down the gully, a freight train of white death that missed the church by 30 yards. The building shuddered, snow pounded the walls, but the structure held. Inside, the women and children had flattened themselves on the floor, and when the roar subsided, a stunned silence followed. No one was dead. No one was buried. The avalanche had been tamed. Dr. Cross found his voice first. "You didn't just lead us through the storm," he said slowly, looking at Gregory with the respect he usually reserved for medical textbooks. "You conducted it like a symphony." But Gregory's mind was already elsewhere. He was feeling the ropes again, testing the tension. The avalanche had buried some of his lines, but the main web still held. The knots had not failed, and it was in that moment, while the snow settled and the wind began at last to weaken, that Gregory knew the whiteout was ending. The storm was losing its fury. When the sky finally cleared on the fourth day, Pine Creek emerged into a world of sculpted white, the drifts shaped by the wind into fantastical forms, the mountains blindingly bright under a pale sun. The villagers emerged one by one, eyes squinting, and they saw something that stopped them cold. Gregory's ropes were everywhere. They ran from house to house, from well to barn, from the church to the sawmill, a complex web of twine and hemp that now lay atop the snow like a dark, purposeful inscription across the valley. In the center of it all stood Gregory, alone, his hand resting on the master line, his face turned toward the sun he could not see but whose warmth he could feel on his skin. The villagers walked those lines in silence, tracing the knots with their fingers, reading the code that had saved them. And one by one they came to Gregory, not with thanks, with questions. "Teach us," Harlan Jessup said, his voice cracking. "Show us how to tie the knots, show us how to read the wind." And Gregory, the blind veteran who had been mocked, dismissed, and sabotaged, finally allowed himself a small, quiet smile, because he understood something that no one else in Pine Creek had yet grasped. The storm had not been the real challenge. The real challenge was coming now. What would the village do with the knowledge that a blind man saw more than they ever had? Would they learn to listen, or would they forget the lesson as soon as the snow melted? And so the teaching began, not with lectures or grand speeches, but with rope and knots handed to each person who asked. Gregory stood in the schoolhouse, the only building with floors clear enough for a dozen pairs of boots, and he untangled the web idea line by line. He began not with the how, but with the why. He had them close their eyes. Every single man, woman, and child old enough to hold rope sat blind for 5 minutes, listening to the wind push against the walls, feeling the vibrations through their feet. That was the first lesson. The world didn't need eyes to speak. Then he taught the knots. The single overhand loop that meant straight ahead, the figure eight that signaled a turn, the clove hitch that meant stop and listen for danger. A double knot meant distance, 2 turns for 100 yards, 3 for 200. The small wooden beads, carved from cedar and threaded onto the line, became braille markers for specific buildings. The carpenter and the blacksmith set up a workshop to mass-produce the beads, shaping them smooth so they'd slide through wet fingers without splinters. Children stayed up late braiding hemp by candlelight, learning to splice lines so cleanly that even Gregory's fingers couldn't catch the join. But it wasn't enough to understand the language. They had to learn the land. Gregory walked the village blindfolded alongside each new knot tier, tracing the main lines he'd already laid. He showed them where the ground subtly dipped toward the ravine, how the sound of the wind changed near the old rock outcropping, why the line to the mill needed an extra anchor at the oak stump. Every knot he'd tied now became a textbook, each one a lesson in sensory geography that no map had ever captured. The minister wrote it all down, not as a sermon, but as a manual, a sort of Bible for navigating darkness. The work began on the first full day after the sky cleared. Families rigged lines from their doors to the nearest central rope, linking their private cabins into the communal web. The blacksmith forged iron eyelets and drove them deep into the sides of buildings, so the ropes wouldn't fray against wooden corners. Harlan Jessup personally oversaw the stringing from his store to the church, and he did it with tears freezing on his cheeks because his grandmother had lived. Josiah Crane named his newborn son after Gregory, a decision his wife Sarah whispered with grateful sobs into the old soldier's ear. The web expanded beyond anything Gregory had originally built. Someone suggested a rope to the cemetery, so the dead wouldn't be forgotten in whiteouts. Another line wound to the schoolhouse, another to the smithy. The outer perimeter stretched to the Crawford homestead at the valley's far edge, a distance of nearly 3 miles, marked with thicker rope and larger beads. By the end of the second week, the village of Pine Creek had become a living map, a web so dense and purposeful that a blind person could walk from the farthest claim to the church without ever lifting a hand from hemp. The final surprising detail, the one that even Gregory hadn't anticipated, came from the doctor. Albert Cross had been writing letters to colleagues in St. Louis and Chicago, describing the web not as a curiosity, but as a medical breakthrough for the blind. He argued that Gregory's method could change lives beyond the frontier, that the web wasn't just a survival tool, but a form of prosthetic perception, an extended nervous system of rope that gave the blind back their movement. Gregory received 2 letters that spring from institutes he'd never heard of, asking him to demonstrate his knots. A photograph was taken of him standing beside his main line, the white dogwood blooming behind him, a hint of that calm, knowing expression on his face. That photograph appeared in a small circulation journal with the caption, "The veteran who taught a winter to behave." It was the first time the outside world glimpsed what Pine Creek now took for granted, but the deeper twist lay not in the recognition. It lay in what the village did when spring fully arrived and the snow melted into mud. The ropes could have come down. They could have been coiled and stored, put away until the next blizzard. They were not. The community voted in a town meeting inside the church to leave the web permanent, not because another whiteout was imminent, but because the ropes had become something else entirely. They were a memory of the moment their eyes had failed and their hearts had found another way to see. They were a monument to the fact that the man they'd laughed at had become their greatest teacher. Gregory himself added the last knot of the original web on a warm April afternoon. It was a complicated one, a triple strand Turk's head tied around the main post of the church porch, incorporating a lock of hair from his own beard, gray and coarse, and a small silver charm given by Mrs. Jessup. He said it was a record that the web had been built by faith as much as hemp. He then handed the master coil to young Elijah Ward, the minister, and said simply, "It's yours now. Keep listening." The children grew up knowing the knots by touch before they could read words. The web became part of the town's identity, woven into weddings and christenings, referenced in lessons and songs. Travelers who passed through were invited to walk it blindfolded, to understand what the village had learned. The mockery that had once defined Gregory Hatch evaporated into a legend that instead defined Pine Creek. And when the next big whiteout struck, 3 winters later, the village survived without a single loss. Not because the storm was weaker, it was, in fact, worse, but because every soul knew exactly which rope to grab in the dark. They held a feast that year in Gregory's honor, though the old veteran simply sat in his usual chair by the stove, coiling yet another length of hemp, his face turned toward the crackling fire. He didn't need to see the gratitude. He could feel it, in every line they had tied, in every hand that still sought his guidance. So the question remains, was Gregory Hatch a genius who invented a new way to navigate the world, or was he simply a man who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that losing one sense forces the others to awaken? The answer might be both, but perhaps the truer answer is that in a world obsessed with what is visible, the most important maps are often drawn in darkness. And the man who can read them, whether mocked or revered, will always find the path home. The true power of Gregory's web was never really about rope. It was about a radical idea that the frontier had never fully accepted, that vulnerability, when studied honestly, can become the seed of a system stronger than brute force. Every knot he tied was an admission of his own limits, and yet every knot became a doorway through the storm. The village of Pine Creek didn't just survive because a blind man could walk. It survived because a whole community finally learned to listen, to feel, to trust the language of the invisible world moving around them. The whiteout that nearly buried them all didn't create Gregory's genius. It simply revealed it, and in doing so, exposed a deeper truth. The people who are forced to navigate darkness often build the most reliable maps. The ones society dismisses as broken are sometimes the only ones who have built an entire architecture of survival in secret. We are all, in some season of life, blind. A crisis descends, and suddenly the familiar roads are gone, the signposts erased, the clear horizon swallowed whole. In those moments, we reach for any guide. Gregory's story asks a difficult question. What are you doing right now in your clear weather to tie your own knots? What lines are you stringing to the people and resources you need in a whiteout? Because mockery comes easy when the sun shines. Preparation is the quiet work that gets laughed at, until the laughter stops dead in the cold wind. There's another layer here that's even more unsettling. The villagers didn't just dismiss Gregory because they thought his idea was foolish. They dismissed him because accepting his method would mean admitting their own fragility, that a blind veteran understood the land better than men with perfect eyes. Pride is a kind of blindness too, and it can be fatal. The moment Harlan Jessup tied himself to Gregory's rope, he wasn't just being rescued. He was surrendering a lie he told himself about who was weak and who was strong. That surrender saved his grandmother's life. It also rewired the social DNA of the settlement. From that winter on, the measure of a person in Pine Creek was not how well they could see, but how well they could feel the truth beneath their feet. So the lingering question isn't really, was Gregory brilliant? The more uncomfortable question is, how many Gregorys have we overlooked? How many people with quiet, painstaking systems of wisdom are standing at the margins of our communities, tying knots we refuse to take seriously? And what storm will have to hit before we finally ask them for the rope? If stories like this remind you that resilience often wears a face the world mocks, then subscribe now. We uncover the untold sagas where the forgotten become the legendary, and where the greatest strength is found in the places nobody thought to look. Until next time, keep your hand on the line.